Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 6 of season 5 of Strange New Worlds, called The Slut Who Ate Its Tail, or actually I guess it's pronounced Selat. That was that bear-like animal that was on Vulcan that we once saw in the animated show that Spock had one as a pet. But as always with the show, nothing makes sense because when we saw the Salat, it had a really short tail, and so I cannot imagine how it could possibly eat its own tail, and so the phrase doesn't really fit the animal as we saw it. And there are many other continuity problems which I will get to, but overall the episode was actually relatively good compared to the others in the season, and it was mostly entertaining, and even though it did have a lot of dumb things about it, and I will get to them, but it was all done in a comedic way, and that kind of makes me forgive it. Because a lot of the silly stuff was kind of deliberately silly, deliberately meant to be funny and kind of self-aware of it. Like there was some really bad technobabble, especially when Scotty said that the antiprotons are antiprotoning, something like that. That kind of reminds me of that line by Marty in Back to the Future when he was checking the DeLorean and saying engine running, the flux capacitor is fluxing. So that's the same kind of joke, I guess. And so this episode seemed to be self-aware of its own silliness, so that kind of makes me forgive it, just as I can forgive a lot of the silliest episodes in the older Star Trek shows. And the episode mostly centers on Kirk, who is still on his own ship, the USS Farragut. He's the first officer there, and he has a female Vulcan captain. And the very beginning kind of annoyed me when Kirk makes a log and complaining about being bored to be in Starfleet, and that kind of reminded me of the opening of Star Trek Beyond, in which Kirk was also whining about how bored he is in Starfleet, and it seems to be because he wants to take risks all the time. So he wants to go down to that planet, and then the Vulcan captain doesn't allow him to do it, and then he seems to be quoting Archer from Enterprise when he says that Starfleet could have sent an automatic probe to take maps of the planets, but it sent us. And then he starts saying, risk is why we're out here, and that reminded me of that speech he made in TOS. And so here he says something really similar, so that means he's been practicing that speech for years until he finally made the full version of it in TOS, and so it wasn't something he improvised in that episode of TOS, but it's a speech he's been working on for years and trying to formulate, and he's ripping off Captain Archer's dialogue from Enterprise apparently. That's what this show now shows us. And this episode kind of feels like it's undermining Kirk a little bit because even later in the episode he says, thank God my captain didn't listen to my advice because I'm too reckless, and my Vulcan female captain was right all along. But he couldn't possibly have known about the danger going to the planet, and so it doesn't really make any sense. It's not as if he was taking some unnecessary risk for no reason. And if they're trying to be as a prequel and show why Kirk became more wise later, but later he made exactly the same kind of decisions. He always went down to the planet by himself, even though he's the captain, not taking any precautions. And so if they're trying to show us as if he learned some kind of lesson, but we know that he didn't, and so then it doesn't make any sense. It makes him look even more idiotic. Also, they kind of turn him into a mass murderer by the end of the episode, and then he kind of regrets it, so that's meant to show as if this is the place in which he learned how to be more peaceful and not so trigger happy, that maybe next time he will try to spare his enemy and all of that. So they're trying to kind of guilt trip him in the end, and it doesn't really make sense because the bad guys are basically piloting what is essentially like a Death Star, and they're going from planet to planet and blowing up whole planets somehow for its resources, and they were about to go to a planet with 100 million people and blow it up too. So under such circumstances, Kirk is a hero. He saved that planet of millions of people and killed a bunch of bad guys. And so why do they try to make him feel guilty for it in the end of the episode? And also it's ridiculous how at first they show that giant enemy ship as something so monstrous, and they say that the entire quadrant was talking about them and being afraid of them as if it's some kind of giant monster. And we do see that it's a giant monster that is able to blow up whole planets. And yet in the very end of the episode they just defeat it easily without any real explanation. So they somehow hit it in the right spot or something and disabled that whole thing and then destroyed it from within, and they did it so easily in the end that it makes it ridiculous that at first they built it up as some giant monstrosity, almost like the Borg in their first appearance, some giant unstoppable force that is trying to consume other planets and other ships and other technologies and take it all into itself. and it's so unstoppable. It's like, the Doomsday Machine in TOS. It also reminded me of that. And at first I even thought they might turn it into that, but that would be a continuity mistake, of course. And so it's something similar, but much sillier, because it looks as if it has an actual giant mouth with teeth, and it's eating up whole starships, and it takes the Enterprise into itself, and it has those tentacle things that the new Trek shows always love so much. Always it's with the giant robot tentacles. We saw that in Discovery, we saw that in Picard, we even saw that in Lower Decks. And now we see it here as well. And so the Enterprise comes to the rescue of the Farragut to fight this giant monster ship. And their weapons are completely useless against it. And then in the very end of the episode, they suddenly easily defeat it without any proper explanation. So it was barely an inconvenience in the end. And so that was also ridiculous. And when those aliens actually boarded the Enterprise and we saw them in the corridors in their spacesuits, and they looked really bulky, as if they're really big and fat underneath, and so I kept thinking those must be the Pakleds, because even their whole ship was the same idea, especially when we saw them in Lower Decks. They had a much bigger ship, which was made up of pieces of many other ships which they stole, and they had those tentacles that they used to grab other ships, and so it's exactly the same kind of idea. And then we see them boarding the Enterprise, and they seem so bulky and clumsy, and so I was sure it's going to be the Pakleds, even though, they only met them in TNG for the first time, so I thought they're probably not going to mention their names. It will turn out to be the Pakleds, but they'll never say their name, and that way preserve continuity. Just like, in Enterprise, Archer met the Borg and the Ferengi, but he never heard their names, and that's why no one knew about them later, because, Archer was terrible at keeping records. He never drew pictures of those aliens, and that's why they didn't know about them in TNG. I know it's kind of ridiculous, but at least they tried to make the effort not to break continuity. And so I was sure it's going to turn out to be the Pakleds, but then the surprise is that those aliens are actually human. And they only find that out after they blew up their giant ship, and then they notice the markings on the hull and see that it's the American flag. And you know what annoyed me? They specifically say that these were humans that left Earth right after the Third World War and before they invented warp drive, which doesn't even make any sense. How exactly did they leave the solar system and get to the edges of the galaxy? I guess it was a sleeper ship or a generational ship that somehow encountered some more powerful aliens and were able to steal their technologies later, I guess. They never really explained how exactly did they become so powerful. They specifically said their ship is impervious to Starfleet weapons and they can blow up entire planets, and all the other species in the galaxy are terrified of them. Even the Klingons and the Gorn are terrified of them, of this one giant ship. And turns out it was humans from before Zephyr Cochrane invented the warp drive. So how exactly did they become so powerful when they only had one ship? So I guess maybe they stumbled on some more advanced technologies or stole it from someone, but they never explained it in this episode. And what annoys me is when they show the American flag, it only has 50 stars, as it does today. But it contradicts an episode we saw in TNG called The Royale, in which they also found the remains of some ancient Earth ship with the American flag, and the flag had 52 stars, and data specifically said that it places it between 2033 and 2079. So it's the same time period in which they say this ship left Earth, in which the American flag should have 52 stars. And yes, I did actually count what they showed us on screen, and it has only 50 stars. So that is once again a continuity mistake with TNG. So maybe it's not in the same timeline with TNG, or maybe those astronauts used some older ship from before 2033 and didn't bother to update the flag on the hull. I guess I can come up with excuses, but it's obviously a continuity mistake. And this whole idea is kind of ridiculous. So you're telling me that an ancient Earth ship, which didn't even have warp drive, somehow was able to reach some distant part of the galaxy and somehow found all these amazing technologies, and then just decided never to return to the rest of humanity and remain separate and hide themselves from humanity and even attack human ships. Like, why? What's the point? What can possibly explain it? And if they had an excuse, kind of like in Space Seed, that that sleeper ship they found belonged to those augmented people from the eugenics wars who were exiled from Earth, and so maybe they don't view themselves as human and they want to build their own empire, some kind of excuse like that, then it would make sense. But here there was no excuse like that. Here they say these were perfectly good, normal humans, not augments, and they said they wanted to leave Earth because of the environmental disaster. And that also contradicts what we saw in Season 2 of Star Trek Picard, in which they said that mission to Europa by René Picard helped save the Earth from the environmental disaster. And that was all in 2024. They said that René Picard brought back some organism which was later used to cure all the pollution and to cure the oceans and all of it. And so how does that fit with what we're now told here, that there was such a big environmental disaster that because of it all these humans decided to leave Earth? I guess maybe it's because of the nuclear war, so it's not related to the previous environmental disaster. But doesn't that render the whole plot of season 2 of Picard kind of pointless if the whole point of that was to prevent the environmental disaster, but later there was even a bigger environmental disaster, so why was it so important to save René Picard and her mission in season 2 of Picard? Now it all doesn't really fit together at all. So the whole thing with the aliens turning out to be humans was kind of ridiculous. It also reminds me of season 3 of Discovery, in which there was an episode about some alien scavengers attacking Earth and trying to steal their dilithium. And in the end of the episode, it turned out they were actually humans from the colony on Titan. And because they were so low on supplies, that's why they were so desperate and were attacking Earth. But they never bothered to reveal to Earth that they were actually fellow humans. And after Earth found out they were actually human, then they were willing to help them. So why didn't they just reveal it from the start? And so the same problem here. Why didn't these aliens simply reveal themselves to be human and just come back home to Earth? What's the point of hiding themselves, pretending to be aliens and just attacking other human ships? There was one moment when one of them spared Pike after seeing he's human, I guess, but none of it makes any sense if you actually think about it. Like, if they somehow explained it, maybe they kind of blended with their technology or something, became kind of like the Borg, or some other idea. Maybe, you know, I would have done this whole giant ship, I would make it organic. I would make it like a giant octopus kind of monster that would also fit with a story Worf once told about some gigantic space creature that devours entire vessels. So if we saw something like that here, and also they can say it was classified in the end, so that it would still remain a legend by the time of TNG, but it would also be a cool idea, show some giant organic creature with organic tentacles devouring vessels. That would just be a more fun idea, I think, instead of the usual robotic tentacles that we saw a million times recently, and so it's exactly the same thing. So maybe when they unmasked that alien, maybe it should have been Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man, then it would make sense why there are robotic tentacles everywhere. And one bit of correct continuity was when they wanted to make the alien ship stop feeding on them, and so they fed it baryon particles, and we know that baryon particles are a waste product from that episode of TNG called Starship Mine, in which they were cleaning the Enterprise from the baryon particles, and so they deliberately started feeding it into that tube, and that made the alien ship want to disconnect from them, so that was kind of funny. And the funniest part of the episode was when they decided to wire the entire ship with old phones to communicate, because that alien ship was also somehow able to jam all communications on the ship. And then Nat Guinan, turns out she's a hoarder and was obsessed with the 1980s for some reason. Everything in her quarters was from the 1980s, and she had a bunch of old phones. And then they take all these old phones and they wire them across the ship, and that is how they're able to communicate with each other, because somehow the jamming technology doesn't affect communication by wires. And that is kind of ridiculous. Why don't they have some kind of backup system like this anyway? Like, why they have to manually do it now? But strangely, now it kind of fits TOS, because in TOS we saw a few instances, especially in early TOS, in which some of the earpieces and stuff was connected with actual wires to the panels, which nowadays does look kind of ridiculous. But I actually made a few videos on this topic and trying to explain a way to come up with excuses why technologies seem to be so primitive in TOS. For example, we often saw them using real paper, and I made theory videos trying to explain those kinds of things away by saying it's all deliberate. They're deliberately going primitive so that they will be harder to hack by enemies such as the Romulans and stuff. So maybe if it all goes through signals in the air, then it's much easier to tap into and to hack and manipulate from afar. But if it's all done with actual physical paper that you transmit from person to person, or those data tapes they physically had to give each other, and why couldn't they transmit them by the air? And so maybe it's all deliberate as part of security, especially if they know there are enemies that are eavesdropping, such as the Romulans, that they are cloaked nearby, maybe you wouldn't detect them, and so if you transmit everything, then it will be easier for the Romulans to tap into it. But if you use physical wiring, and if you write it on a piece of paper, or if you deliver it in a closed data tape, which is unhackable from the outside because it doesn't transmit any signals and doesn't receive any signals. And so I actually made a few videos on that topic, maybe I'll link them in the end, in which I try to come up with excuses for why the technology in TOS seems to be so primitive when actually it's all deliberate. And even the computer voice being so primitive, I said maybe it's deliberate because maybe after those events of Star Trek Discovery, in which an AI computer almost destroyed all life in the galaxy, maybe they took precautions and deliberately designed all the computers to be kind of slower and to be maybe deliberately talking like a robot so that people will always know that they're talking with an AI and not an actual person. Because remember that control thing from season 2 of Discovery, who was faking holograms and faking itself as if it's admirals talking with people giving fake orders. And so maybe after all of these events, Starfleet decided to limit the abilities of computers to prevent any such event of an AI takeover of starships and all of it. So maybe it was a feature that the computer will talk slowly like a robot, like this: I am the ship's computer. That way, if I'm talking like this, you will always know I'm a computer and not an actual person impersonated by a computer. So I made up excuses like that to say maybe it's all deliberate. And so what they did in this episode is kind of similar. So because of the jamming technology preventing them from using the normal communicators, they had to wire the whole ship and hook up all these old phones and old joysticks to pilot the ship. So it is kind of ridiculous in many ways, but it's also kind of funny, and it actually fits with TOS, because when we saw Spock using the earpiece with the connected wire, maybe it's a remnant from the events of this episode. So maybe they actually left some of those wires around in just in case they would ever need it, and so once in a while they would still use it. So I can come up with an excuse now to fit it all together. So it definitely is kind of ridiculous, but it's kind of self-aware of being silly, and it is kind of funny. And the only things that annoyed me was the things that didn't make any sense and not really funny either. So why did the giant enemy ship, which was so dangerous in the beginning, was suddenly defeated so easily in the end as if it was barely an inconvenience? Why exactly were those humans pretending not to be humans? What were they hiding from? So that was just as stupid as that Titan colony in Discovery, who pretended not to be humans for no reason, and once it was revealed they were humans, suddenly Earth was able to help them, and so why did they hide that fact? And the same thing here. Why did the alien ship need to do all of it? Like they specifically said, it blew up an entire planet, and it was going to blow up another planet which was habited by 100 million people. And it was going to that planet, so was it actually going to do that? If they revealed that there was some misunderstanding, that actually it was going there to feed those people on that planet or something, if they revealed that, then that whole moral dilemma thing would be more clever. Like in the end, Kirk feels regret that he killed all those people, and it was all a misunderstanding. If he wasn't so trigger happy, he would have made peace with them, something like that. But then I guess he would go to jail. If he was actually guilty, then why is he allowed to be captain later? So under the circumstances, his actions were perfectly justified. So why does he need to feel guilty again? And so it's as if the episode really wants to do such a moral argument kind of thing, but the situation doesn't really fit. So what difference does it make if they were human or not? They were still going to attack a planet and destroy a whole planet and kill millions of people. So what difference does it make if they were human or not? They were still just as bad. So what's the point of feeling guilty about it later? So just because they're human, suddenly it's not okay to kill them when they're going to kill other people. And if they were aliens, then it would be okay. So isn't that kind of a speciesism? So if they're human, suddenly you wouldn't attack them. If they're not human, then it's okay to attack them. So the whole message of it doesn't really make any sense. And so the fact that they never properly explain how those primitive humans got their hands on such advanced technology, which is more powerful than anything they've ever seen, so it doesn't make any sense. And the thing with the flag really annoys me, that they specifically show the American flag, and they counted it, and it has only 50 stars, even though according to data, it should have 52 stars, because I guess in 2033, Canada would join the United States and some other country. And you know what I think they should have done when they showed those humans? Showed them kind of sniffing drugs from a tube in their suit and make it look like those soldiers that we saw in the Court of Horrors that Q showed the crew in the first episode of TNG, when he specifically said that was a court from the year 2079. the post-atomic horror period. And so if they show that those were those types of humans from such a dark period of history, then it would make sense why they're so evil. Maybe those were survivors of the nuclear war and they escaped Earth in the darkest time, and so maybe their whole mental attitude was still the same, just to survive at all costs and to be aggressive and all of it, and still using the same practices of using drugs in combat. And so if they showed something like that, that would be cool. But instead they said, no, those were the best of humanity from the remains of the space program, and so whatever happened to them out in space. And so they never actually explained, so what happened, why did they have to become space pirates? The idea could have been good, but because it wasn't properly explained and it makes so little sense, then it's just kind of annoying. And maybe it would have been better to simply make these aliens the Pakleds, and then it would fit the way we saw them in Lower Decks, which was exactly like in this episode. They had a giant ship made up of pieces of many other ships, and using those robot tentacles to grab onto other ships. And so it's exactly what we see here, and also the way they're defeated so easily in the end. So if they're stupid, that maybe they seem to be so intimidating at first, but once you realize they're stupid and you can easily fool them, then that can explain how they defeat them so easily in the end, because it makes no sense. They kind of fake something to make their ship look valuable so that that ship will try to come and consume it, and then they feed it baryon particles to scare their tentacle, and then they suddenly shoot something at a specific spot, and somehow that whole ship blows up easily, and so nothing makes any sense. And that's my biggest problem with the show. If it made a little bit more effort to actually make sense, then it will be so much better, and I can live with all the silly elements they showed us because they are actually funny, and so I can forgive it, and that will actually be useful to explain some of the silliest things in TOS, as I mentioned. And so I don't really mind those parts. I actually enjoy those parts of the episode which were silly, but the overall plot making no sense, that's my biggest problem, I think. So that's my thoughts on it. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it all in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.